Rejoice, young man, while you are young. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Follow the inclination of your heart and the desire of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Banish anxiety from your mind and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life is vanity. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return with the rain. In the day when the guards of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the women who grind cease working because they are few, and those who look through the windows see dimly. When the doors on the street are shut, and the sound of grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. When one is afraid of heights, and terrors in the road. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because all must go to their eternal home, and the mourners will go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. All is vanity. We ask God's blessing on Brian as he brings God's word to us from this text.
Good morning. Well, it's good to see you all on this lovely morning when we have this nice, inspiring passage before us here. I have to apologize. You can see some of my poor procrastinating habits up front. The text that Jean read is correct. The text on the screen is not. But as she mentioned, we are going to be finishing the book of Ecclesiastes. And because we are now in the summer, and I like to keep my sermon analogies relevant and seasonal, I'd like to talk to you about a clip of Charles Dickens' masterpiece, A Christmas Carol. I have to confess that I know that it's weird to talk about A Christmas Carol in June, but I think that it makes the point that Ecclesiastes makes so well. And so I ask that you bear with me as we kind of go through this. Well, as you probably know, A Christmas Carol tells the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, who is a greedy businessman who cares about no one except himself, until one Christmas Eve when he is visited by three ghosts or spirits. The ghost of Christmas past, who forces him to kind of revisit his old traumas and the things that led him to the choices he's made. The ghost of Christmas present, who shows him the negative impact his choices are having on the people around him. And then the ghost of Christmas yet to come, who is the scariest of all the ghosts, both in his appearance and in the vision that he presents. He forces him to face the future to which Scrooge's life is heading. And he takes him to a future in which someone from Scrooge's town has died, but it's clear that there is no love lost for this person. People don't have anything positive to say about him. If there's any discussion at all, people are fighting over who gets to inherit his stuff. And in fact, the overall response is that nobody seems to care that this person has died. And this fills Scrooge with dread, because he already knows that the person that he's hearing about is almost certainly him. And he begs the spirit or the ghost to not to force him to see this conclusion, but the ghost is unmoving. He takes him to a graveyard and leads him to this inevitable conclusion. And I want to look at this passage as it appears. It says, the spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as he had been, but he dreaded the new meaning he saw in its solemn shape. Before I draw near to that stone to which you point, said Scrooge, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Spirit, he cried, tight clutching at its robe, hear me, I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope? And I think that is an excellent question for us to ask Ecclesiastes. Why show us this? Why go into this speech if we are past all hope? Because the entire book of Ecclesiastes is a search for meaning and purpose in life. And Ecclesiastes explores all these different possibilities. Could pleasure and riches provide purpose in life? Well, no, not really. Those things eventually fade and lose their joy. Could it be possible that building up a legacy and passing it on to the next generation brings meaning to life? Honestly, you have no guarantees that anything that you do is going to last, so that's not really one either. Well, what about wisdom and just finding the intrinsic treasures of knowledge? Wisdom only brings more grief, so that can't be it either. And it seems like after exploring all of these different options, the conclusion that Ecclesiastes comes to is that there is nothing. That there is no meaningful life, that there is no hope. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's because you ended the reading at verse 8. But actually, Ecclesiastes goes on for a few more verses and ends on this more positive line, where it says, fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. See, this expresses a kind of renewed confidence in God. It encourages people to keep chugging along, following the biblical path. And I'll acknowledge that this is more hopeful. However, these are not the words of the teacher whom we've been hearing all along. You see, after we get to about chapter 12, verse 9, we get a kind of epilogue, as though a commentator or an editor wants to give us some final thoughts after we've heard the teacher's words. It starts by talking about the teacher, saying, besides being wise, the teacher also taught people knowledge, weighing and studying many proverbs. And then after saying a bit more about the teacher, comes to this conclusion, fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every judgment, including every secret thing, everything into judgment, whether good or evil. So that's nice, but it's not the final words of the teacher himself. It's the final words of one of his disciples, one of his interpreters. The very last words that we have from the teacher, this incredibly wise person who has been leading us in thought for the past 6 weeks, are these. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, everything is vanity. Or to translate it a bit more literally, vapor of vapors, says the teacher, everything is vapor. Everything is like a gust of wind, a mere breath that vanishes within seconds. It's empty, it's weak, it's nothing. So again, I think it is worth asking, why are we doing this? Why are we reading this if there seems to be no hope? Well, I suppose you could say that there is a kind of constructive message in Ecclesiastes. It's a message to kind of seize the day, to make the most of the opportunities that we have, to get out and smell the roses, if you will. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, how the author of Ecclesiastes appropriately encourages us to appreciate the good things in life. And he kind of tries to come back to this point towards the end, especially emphasizing youth. He says, "Rejoice, young person, while you are young, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth," right? Time is fleeting, so enjoy the things around you. All right, that's not a bad message to hear. But then the teacher goes on and tries to add this advice. "Banish anxiety from your mind and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vapor." I'm not sure how that's helpful, right? Telling somebody to banish anxiety from their mind is kind of like saying, don't think about a pink elephant, right? Like as soon as you say it, it immediately makes you start thinking about the things you should be anxious about. It makes you think about the pink elephant. And besides that general point, it seems that the teacher himself, after giving this advice, cannot help but going into his own anxiety, but just giving this long speech about how dreadful old age and the end of life can be. And so he begins by trying to get back on this positive note about youth and says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come. I think we're getting a bit autobiographical here. "And the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them." And then he goes on, and he gives a series of these kind of strange statements and metaphors that many commentators believe are speaking about different functions of the body that sometimes break down as you get older, right? So he says, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened. It's probably a metaphor for vision and how your vision gets darker as you get older. And clouds return with the rain, and it gets a bit blurrier. It goes on and says, "In the day when the guards of the house tremble," when you get older, your arms and legs might shake a bit. "And the strong men, your bones are bent. And the women who grind cease working because they are few." Even in terms of the language here, this seems to be referring to teeth, your molars, and how your teeth might cease working as you get older. And on it goes. Now, I want to note that this is not the only picture of old age in the Bible. There are many passages that celebrate old age as the crown of life, as a peak of wisdom, as something we can enjoy. But let's be honest, this is kind of a part of it too, right? That these things, that parts of the body get harder and harder to deal with. And this is something that the teacher simply bemoans. So I'm not going to go through a point-by-point explanation of every single one, but I do want to come to the very end of it, where it ultimately leads to the great end of life, death. It says, "And dust returns to the earth as it was, and breath returns to the God who gave it." In other words, our body decomposes, and our spirit or our soul goes back to God, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. "Vanity of vanities," says the teacher, "vapor of vapors, all is vapor." Wow. I don't know if the teacher had a constructive purpose or if this was just a kind of misery loves company kind of speech. But it's a hard book to read. It kind of is a downer. But there's another question that we can be asking. Not just why does the teacher say these words, but why did the Holy Spirit see fit to include this book in our Bible? Since, after all, we have promises of God that the teacher did not. We know, for example, that there will be a great day of judgment when God will make things right. That there is life after death and hope for restoration and healing and the salvation of things that were seemingly lost. That's a very hopeful message, and the teacher simply wasn't aware of some of these promises. So why does the Bible want us to hear this message? Well, I would suggest that the book of Ecclesiastes functions sort of like the ghost of Christmas yet to come in A Christmas Carol. It tells us how things would be for us were it not for the intervention of God. Because, frankly, without God, without the hope of new life, of a God who loves us and guides us through history, life is, in an ultimate sense, meaningless. Now, my purpose in saying this is not to take a swipe at atheists necessarily. Of course, atheists being people who don't believe in God at all. I certainly don't think that atheists are somehow less moral people than others because of their lack of belief. Some of the atheists that I know are among the most ethical people out there. Nor do I see this as a kind of way that we should scare atheists into embracing faith. I don't think being scared into faith is a particularly good thing. People ought to follow Jesus because they are inspired to do so. But I do think that this is a burden that you have to bear if you embrace a worldview without God, as many leading atheists of the past and present have acknowledged. Think of it this way, right? So there are some atheists, for example, who are very ethical people who would never lie or steal or cheat or harm another human being. And we would say that that's good. But why is that good? Why is it a way that matters to live if there's not a God or morality out there to set the terms of that goodness? If it's just because it makes the individual feel good, fine. But for somebody else, lying and cheating and harming others might feel good, right? If it's because we have this kind of evolutionary wiring to do that, why ought we to follow our evolutionary wiring if it's more beneficial to just live selfishly and harmfully, right? It leaves us empty. Or you might say that there are atheists, and I know there are, who invest very deeply in the future of humanity. And that is lovely, except for the fact that we know that humanity's future without God is bound to end. If not in the near future due to nuclear war or environmental disaster, certainly there will be a time when the sun runs out of light, when the Milky Way galaxy collapses on itself, or ultimately when the universe experiences a heat death. There's no escaping this, and so investing in humanity in a context without God, to me, feels a bit like trying to elongate the life of a dying dog, right? Like, you might be able to stretch it out a bit longer, but ultimately you wonder what's the point. But again, I'm not saying this. I think that people should hold their beliefs in integrity. I think it does have a bit to say, perhaps, to agnostics and skeptics, and perhaps the verse that speaks the most to them comes a little bit earlier in Ecclesiastes 11, where it says, "Whoever observes the wind will not sow, and whoever regards the clouds will not reap." If we find ourselves skeptical, wondering whether or not there's a God, whether there's an afterlife, but perhaps there could be. We should remember that a farmer who spends all his time looking at the clouds and trying to get absolute certainty about the weather before planting or reaping is going to miss out on a lot of valuable time, right? We don't need to wait on certainty to start investing if there really is this plausible hope of a meaningful life in front of us. But ultimately, I don't think this is even oriented toward agnostics or skeptics. After all, the teacher was a person who himself believed in God. Remember, the teacher said, I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it nor taken away from it. The teacher was a believer, and this did not keep him from having a despairing view of life. The problem was that he didn't know of anything that humans could do that would last. He thought that everything that we invested our lives in would eventually amount to nothing, because the same fate comes to all, to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to those who sacrifice and those who do not sacrifice. He couldn't think of anything that a person could do that would avoid them from reaching the ultimate reality that we would just die, and the world in its cycles of good and evil, of civilizations rising and falling, of seasons changing, would just continue along the same path that it has been from time immemorable to now. But we have the promises of God. And this is not from Ecclesiastes, this is from John 3:16. So again, I apologize for the lack of updating my PowerPoint here. But you might recall that there are some very hopeful promises in the Bible for us, including the promise that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him may not perish but have eternal life. This is an extraordinary passage, one that is so familiar that perhaps we take it for granted, but it's a promise that there is more than just what exists in this life. And I want to note that this isn't just about heaven, and it isn't just a promise that things are better then and there, but it also has implications for here and now and the way that we live our lives today. Because, as Hebrews says, we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. We are part of a world, of a universe that God protects, that bears fruit 30, 60, and 100 times into eternity. The things that we do now, we may not always be able to see the impact that they have, but we can have faith that God will protect them and cultivate them, and that even a cup of cold water that we give to a child will have powerful ramifications that echo throughout eternity. So it is the case that eventually all of us are going to face old age, if we're not there already. That we will have times when our vision begins to fade, when our bones become brittle, when our arms and legs begin to shake, maybe our teeth start to fall out. And if we look back and see that we have spent our lives chasing pleasure or trying to leave some legacy that we can't really protect after we go, or even trying to seek some great wisdom, then we might despair. But for us who have lived our lives in the hope of God, we can trust that the God who has loved us and been with us throughout our lives will carry the work on unto eternity. And so when we wake up from this dream that is Ecclesiastes, we should be grateful, because there is indeed something new under the sun.